Good afternoon. Welcome to the Heritage Foundation. I'm John Hilbolt, Director of Lectures and Seminars. It's my privilege to welcome you to our Lieberman Auditorium. We, of course, welcome those who join us via the Internet at our heritage.org website. We remind our Internet viewers that questions can be submitted via email addressed simply to speaker@heritage.org. And we also remind everyone that our program is captured live. It will then be archived on our website, heritage.org, for future reference. For those in-house in this technological age, please check that cell phones or pagers, if you still have a pager, have been turned off or muted to avoid any unnecessary electronic interference. Hosting our program today has been Lieberman. Mr. Lieberman is our Senior Policy Analyst in the Thomas A. Rowe Institute for Economic Policy Studies. He specializes in the Clean Air Act, climate change, and the impact of environmental policy on energy prices. Before joining Heritage, Mr. Lieberman served as Associate Counsel and Director of Air Quality Policy at the Competitive Enterprise Institute. His work on environmental and energy issues appears in numerous newspapers, magazines, and journals, and he frequently testifies before congressional committees on these vital issues. Ladies and gentlemen, my colleague, Ben Lieberman. Ben?
Well, thank you all for coming, and thanks to Dr. Fine, who will be talking today about oil shale in the Rocky Mountains and its potential to be an extremely important component of our domestic energy supply. Now, if there's been a theme to America's energy policy over the last 35 years or so, it's been one of constraints and of limitations placed on an energy supply. This includes such things as the restrictions on drilling in the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge, or ANWR, or in the 85% of America's offshore areas that are currently off limits. In fact, to generalize a little beyond petroleum and transportation fuels, just about every element of our nation's energy supply and energy infrastructure, if it's not inadequate now, it runs the risk of becoming inadequate in the years ahead, given the expectations of continued energy demand growth. I think it's not going too far to say that we haven't had an energy policy in this country so much as we've had an anti-energy policy. For example, a Department of Energy study identified more than 30 federal legal regulatory impediments to energy production in the U.S. These hurdles are especially challenging on federal lands where much of the nation's energy potential lies, and that includes most of our oil shale. And the problem is not just areas where energy production is restricted outright, but also areas where the regulatory provisions or even years or decades of procedural delays and inevitable lawsuits have their effect. And while these environmental and other restrictions remain in place and are enough of a challenge, we also have the specter of global warming legislation, which could make matters even more difficult for the domestic fuel supply. Now, some of these restrictions came about as a reaction to events such as the 1979 Exxon Valdez oil spill. No, that was 1989, excuse me. 1979 was 3 Mile Island as another example of something that helped crimp our energy choices. Others have accumulated over time, especially during periods of cheap energy like the 1990s, when the political path of least resistance was to give in to the demands of environmentalists and not in my backyard or NIMBY activists. But times have changed. The need for our energy today is far greater and will become greater still in the years ahead. And technological advances have reduced the environmental footprint from energy production, so there are less risks, less worries about domestic energy production. We're long overdue to revisit our domestic energy policy with an eye towards increasing access and with fewer roadblocks to access. To be sure, not all or even most of our energy problems are self-imposed. The news, of course, is dominated by worrisome events from oil-exporting nations that are unstable and unfriendly to the U.S., and there are far too many nationalized oil companies around the world, not enough private ones, not enough commitment among oil-producing nations to free market principles like private property rights, rule of law, limited government, transparency, openness to foreign investment. But however serious the energy problems the world may impose upon us, we've made matters worse by not making good use of what's available here. Now, one potential source of domestic energy is the trillions with a T, barrels of oil trapped in shale beneath mostly federal lands in Colorado, Wyoming, and Utah. And there are some small-scale test projects currently underway. But there are also a number of hurdles that have to be overcome, and not just the environmental ones that I touched on. Some of you may remember that oil shale was the subject of some false starts back in the 1970s and early 1980s. So there's valid reason for skepticism, even beyond the environmental, legal, and regulatory challenges, questions about the economic and technological viability of oil shale. And there certainly will be political opposition. The same forces that have kept ANWR restricted, they're also equally as opposed to oil shale. And of course, any tough measures designed to fight global warming will make things even more difficult for oil shale to proceed. So the challenges are very real, but the potential here is enormous. If we can overcome the economic, technological, regulatory, political, and other barriers to producing oil from shale, America could have perhaps 5 times more oil than Saudi Arabia. That's an awful lot of oil, but there's also some very big ifs involved as well. Well, today we're going to explore those ifs. What exactly is shale oil, and what has to happen in the years ahead for oil shale to meet its potential, and what would doing so mean for the nation? And here to help explore these very fascinating questions, I'm pleased to welcome Dr. Daniel Fine.
Thank you for the introduction, and I'm so absolutely pleased to be invited to Heritage Foundation and to develop with Heritage and in Washington what might be called the shale story, which currently is almost silent with regard to national policy, world petroleum policy, and so on. Earlier on, I did a book on resource war in the late Reagan administration, and that was based upon how to understand, how to conceptualize strategic resources, oil, gas, and hard rock minerals. I'm currently based both on the East Coast and in New Mexico, and there in New Mexico participating in the New Mexico model, energy model for the country and maybe the world. It's very interesting that the New Mexico model is based on a diversity of fuels. It is not exclusive. In fact, the language of alternative, conventional, bio, geo is almost disappearing. The concern from a statewide is that what is fuel? Where is the supply of fuel going to come from? And the model is a diversification, meaning you have in New Mexico, you have solar, the national laboratories, you have the 4th largest producer of natural gas. California depends on New Mexico for 30% of its gas, electricity. And you have the potential for hydrogen, and you have CO2, exports, and a whole range, all of the fuels. That's a good model for the country to follow. One portfolio, all the assets, how to evaluate, how to assess them in terms of production of energy and fuels. Robert Gallagher, who served in Washington in the Clinton administration in DOE, is director of the New Mexico Oil and Gas Association, and he participates in this as well. Now, today, I want to strike a chord, get some resonance for shale. It's a very big part of American history. First of all, it's not shale is not yesterday, in a sense. It goes back to 1913, to Winston Churchill, to the British essentially establishing a state company going into then Persia to secure the access to petroleum for the Navy. And in the United States, we did the same. The administration at that time established in DOE, one of the longest established department called the Office of Strategic Reserves and Oil Shale. from 1913 on.